Hey everyone, Brian from Witch Doctor here, doing a video on finding your headspace. So, got this new chambered barrel from Speedy Gonzalez for a tuner test we'll be doing here pretty soon. Went out and fire formed some brass and want to now see what my headspace is for these puppies. First thing in the process is to remove the carbon from the neck. I don't want anything getting hung up there in the chamber as I do this process. Second thing is to check the size of the brass. It did not stretch beyond what the overall brass length dimension is for the chamber. That's important because for this type of headspace test, you don't want anything binding on the piece of brass, and I'll go over that in a little bit. The other thing too is go ahead and deprime the cases. I have this nifty Frankfurt Arsenal deprimer, so I don't have to run the brass through a die to deprime. I can just deprime it with this thing. Okay, so bam. What I do is I take 5 random cases out of all the brass that I fire formed, and I do exactly that. I clean off the necks, pop the primers out without running it through a sizing die. Next thing I do, I take the rifle, pull the bolt, take out the firing pin. That way the bolt doesn't have any type of resistance. Notice the bolt will just fall once you, see? Okay, so basically have a strip bolt stripped to the firing pin. I take the 5 cases and I take my case gauge, my L.E. Wilson case gauge micrometer body, and then I stick the micrometer on top, and I take measurements of the fired brass. Okay, so this one's showing about 3 1/4 thousandths. I write that down. I'll usually put down HS for headspace test. 3 1/4, and it's in the positive direction on my indicator. So plus 3 1/2 thousandths. So the case is stretched out quite a bit because I think they started at minus 7 or 8 thousandths. So now they're at plus, oh, this one is 1, 2, 3, 3 1/2. Okay. And I leave them in the order that I looked at them. That's going to be important in a minute. I'll tell you why. Okay, let's go to this other one. This one's 3 1/2, plus 3 1/2. Okay, showing pretty good consistency with 3 1/2 thousandths there. Oops. And this one is, oh, this one is only 1 1/2. This was one that I'm sure that I loaded a small load. I did a very light load on a few pieces of brass, but that's 1 1/2. So that one did not fire form all the way. And this one is 1, 2, 3 1/4. Okay. Again, I like this tool. It's very convenient and quick for measuring headspace. L.E. Wilson case gauge micrometer, case gauge body. Okay, and then so we got them all measured. Alright, next thing what I do is I take the largest, the ones at headspace the largest, which these 2 at 3 1/2 did, and I make sure I have a clean chamber here. Okay, so make sure that the chamber is clean. Do not perform this style of checking your headspace unless you have a clean chamber. Stick that piece of brass in and then see if it falls. It doesn't. Okay, it won't fall, so then I press down and I sort of get a indication of how much pressure it takes to push this case down. It takes quite a bit. Yeah, that's you can just tell when you do this test, like, you know, how much pressure you're putting on. This took quite a bit of pressure. Okay, then I'll take the next largest size, which is, I have 2 at 3 1/4. Do the same thing. Yeah, about the same amount of pressure. So what that's telling me is that 3 1/2, 3 1/4 is still kind of pushing up to the chamber there and causing some hard bolt close there. Let's see what happens with 1.5. So this one is 0.02 smaller than the most stretched cases. Oh, and what do you know? Bolt just drops on its own. So that tells me right there that about, yep, 3.5 thousandths is probably the maximum stretch size, and that if I size these 2 thousandths, the bolt will drop freely. So in my head spacing testing, what I found was, yeah, you definitely want at least 1.5 thousandths shoulder bump, and possibly 2. 2 is the max. 1.5 to 2 is good. It seems that the tests were showing 1.5 to 2 is good. So now I know, based on this test, that I'm gonna size these to anywhere from 1.5 to 2, which will give me again 1.5 to 2 thousandths shoulder bump. As long as I'm within that range, I'm good. Now you might wonder, well, why did he only get one at 1.5 and the rest at 3.5 and 3/4? What I do is I intentionally load a few that have very little powder in them, just for this reason, because I want to get some cases that aren't sized completely to perform this test. What I'm going to do next is sort of verify this by actually sizing some of these 3.5 brass pieces, and then I'm going to size them down to 2 and then 1.5 and see what happens. Alright, for the sizing process, I'm going to be using Highline Precision sizing wax. There is no nasty smell. It is a lanolin based, so you can tell people that, hey, look, while I'm sizing brass, I'm also, washing my hands with soap. Yeah, not funny. Anyway, so take that puppy, make sure you got the right shell holder. This die is set to bump at about 1.5. So actually, what I'm going to do is, to make it bump at 2, I am going to loosen this, and all I have to do is move this nifty little PMA tool ring that I put on all of my competition dies. I'm sorry, dies. Yeah, sizing dies. Well, this is a bushing and full-length sizing die made from Bullet Central. This is the Micron series die. Really good die. And I'm just going to move it 0.5 thousandths in the direction so that I can get a bump of 2 thousandths. And that's it. I don't have to unscrew the entire die and guesstimate how much turn and then crank it back down. It's simply just unscrew this and then move it. See the hash marks? Just move it 0.5 hash mark, and then it should bump to 2 thousandths. Okay, die was moved 0.5 thousandths in the direction of increasing the bump size there. From, I think it was bumping from 1 to 1.5. Now it should be bumping at 2. Okay, so bump those 2 and wipe the lanolin off. Don't want to get the chamber full of soap. Also neck size too. Neck sized, I think I put a bushing in there to neck size these down about, give me about 3.5, 4 thousandths neck tension. After that, go ahead and put them in your case gauge micrometer, or I'm going to go ahead and put it in my case gauge micrometer, and should measure to 2 thousandths. This one is 2 1/4. And this one is, yeah, maybe less than 2 1/4, about 2. Okay, so let's take the one that's 2 1/4 and 2. Again, maybe 1/4. It's barely moved above the 2 hash mark. Let's try that one and see what we get. Okay, bolt close, little stiff. Not as stiff as the 3.5, but I can still feel some resistance there. Let's take the 2, one that was closer to 2. Okay, and that closure is easier than the 2 1/4, but still just a little bit. So just a little, I need a little bit of resistance to bring that puppy down. Let's try bringing these two down to like 1 3/4 and see what happens. Okay, one thing to do before sizing the brass is to anneal it. We found is annealing definitely increases the reliability of the actual shoulder sizing. What I have to do first though, since I have not I have not annealed this brass before, is to obtain my Aztec code on my Annealing Made Perfect Mark II annealer. That Aztec code is basically a code that tells this machine exactly how to anneal this brass. So at sort of what duration of temperature to hit this brass for optimal annealing. So I'm going to stick that piece of brass in there, tell this program what pilot is in the machine, and then analyze it. There goes my lights flickering because this thing takes up a lot of energy. And it generates a code for you, and that code is the code that you're going to want to write down. It ruins one piece of brass. We call this the sacrificial case. After that puppy is sacrificed now, you have the code to appropriately anneal your brass. In this case, the code is 0142. I'm also going to write that down. What I do is I keep all my codes on here. So 6 ppc, this is a 268 neck. So I'm going to say for Speedy 1-0142. And now I know for that is the Aztec code, and I'm also going to write it down in here. 0142 in my data book about my Speedy barrel, my Bart Souter and Speedy barrel, okay? And so that one is annealed. Pop that out. Let's anneal the other three. Okay. Alright, then we wait for them to cool and we go ahead and resize. Okay, so we use the PMA tool to go ahead and get to the right size that we wanted at about 1 3/4, which is roughly, you know, 1.5 or so, maybe a little more than 1.5 shoulder bump, 1.5 thousandths. So let's try that one. See how it goes. Okay, and we have, yeah, very loose bolt. So I'm thinking this is a good place to leave the die, is right here. See how you get it, you know, the bolt kind of going down freely in some areas, and it's a little bit, got to kind of touch it, tap it slightly to get it back down. That's where I'm going to keep it. I've found anywhere from 1.5 to 2 thousandths is good. So what I'm going to do now is confirm that measurement first with my tool here. Yep, so about 1 3/4, and then I'm going to write on here bump to 1 3/4, because at 1.5 you saw that bolt just drop down by itself. 1 3/4 you saw it drop down by itself for a little bit and then require ever so slight pressure to go completely down. So I'm going to circle that. And then I'm also going to go back to my PMA tool here and find out where on the die. Looks like it's set at, so you got 16, 17, 18, 19. And then you see it says, so you got the number 16, the number's 20. It's 1 below 20 and 3 above 16. So it's setting 19. So I'm going to go ahead and tighten this back. And then go into my book and say setting 19 on PMA tool. Okay, now here's the interesting thing. That setting is not going to be the same through the life of this brass. This brass is probably going to get fired maybe 30 to 50, 60 times. And it's just not going to be, a setting of 19 is not going to produce the same amount of bump as it does when the brass is relatively new. I'll just put it that way. So as this brass, for whatever reason, is unable to bump to 1 3/4 to 2/1000 on the setting 19, I will have to turn that ring to another setting that basically increases the bump on the shoulder on the brass. Now, annealing the brass reduces that to a massive degree. So having that, brass annealed will probably keep me on setting 19 for a long time. If I didn't anneal, I would probably be off of setting 19 after 1 or 2 firings. I've gone through this process of measuring thousands of pieces of brass after being fired, and if it's not annealed, like, it gets seriously work hardened. It takes a lot more to bump that shoulder down, which means I have to crank down on the die, or spin up on the PMA tool to bring the die down. And but with annealing, it doesn't. It usually sort of bumps, consistently over several firings. But there will come a point, though, where I will have to change the setting even with annealing. That's just the nature of brass. Happens all the time. But with annealing, I will reduce the likelihood that will happen for the first several firings on this brass. Okay, well, thank you everybody for tuning in. Please subscribe, like, and share. Also, check out my Patreon. Thank you.